On this edition of Independent Sources, defending food deserts, why more New Yorkers are turning to urban farming for healthy and affordable food.
And Under Siege, holding offenders accountable for sexual crimes against women in war zones.
Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Viano Ravinka.
And I'm Gary Pierre-Pierre. Lately, there's been some debate over whether food deserts actually exist. The term refers to areas where residents cannot access healthy and affordable food. Researchers now argue that there are plenty of supermarkets serving these neighborhoods. Yet, residents continue to make unhealthy food choices.
Tonight, we'll talk about these assertions with Teresa Hassler of the New York Coalition Against Hunger. But before we do that, we'll have a look at what some people in poor neighborhoods around the city are doing to harvest healthier meals.
Marlene Peralta starts us off with this report on the trend toward urban farming.
This particular planting is a plant that you know if you're a true farmer.
Okay.
This
Colleen Alsop learned to farm back home in Guyana. He harvests these kinds of vegetables in one of the unlikeliest places, in the heart of Brooklyn, at the East New York farm.
My backyard home in the same community, I get so much thing growing there, cabbage, I get squash, if you see squash, right in when people was living there, and they know that the little space they could use. And right now, they're shocked.
Several gardens in the area were started by immigrants like Alsop. Many of them come from southern states, the Caribbean, and Latin America.
East New York is a community that doesn't necessarily have a lot of access to fresh fruits and vegetables, but it also has a pretty strong agricultural tradition. And so there were already a lot of community gardens in this neighborhood when this project started.
The East New York Farm is just one of the many farming initiatives started by community-based organizations and local residents in poor neighborhoods around New York. Farming is the response to address the lack of access to fresh fruits and vegetables.
We like to grow the produce that people want to eat that they can't necessarily find in the stores, or if they can find it, it's not going to be local and organic. A lot of those crops are West Indian crops, so bitter melon, long beans, okra. We also grow a lot of different kinds of greens, collard greens, kale, Swiss chard, a lot of peppers, eggplant.
Although urban gardening in New York City is not new, experts say its popularity has grown due to the increasing campaigns to support community gardens and the number of innovative urban agriculture projects that are popping up. This is at a time when more than half of all New Yorkers and nearly 40% of public school students are obese or overweight.
New York City has one of the biggest urban agriculture systems in the country. We have about 500 community gardens, about 80% of them actually grow food. And NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, has about 600 community gardens, and most of those also grow food. And so we've already got a huge infrastructure for urban agriculture.
Just across the river in East Harlem, Gina Kitley, a chef by profession, brought her nonprofit program Nourishing NYC to an already established community garden to educate locals about healthy eating alternatives.
All of the Nourishing NYC programs are all free, especially in East Harlem. It's a low-income area. It has the most density of obesity and diabetes in all of Manhattan. So it's a really in-need community. And we're not reinventing the wheel here. We looked at what programs work.
Kitley says that living in an urban setting with little open space doesn't prevent New Yorkers from growing their own food.
Even if you don't have a big plot of dirt, you can do it in your housing, in your apartment, and it gets people to realize I can grow something. You know, this is exciting, I can do it. This is what basil looks like coming out of, the ground, and it connects them to food, it's a big gap that's kind of missing in this community. People don't understand what food is like when it's not in a box.
We'll never be able to grow enough food in New York City to feed people, but it can be a huge help. So in low-income neighborhoods, certainly people are growing enough food to improve their diets.
The success of urban agriculture in New York City is such that programs like the United Way of New York City's Seed Grant is providing funds for them. And even the New York City Department of Environmental Protection is becoming involved to help its expansion. For Independent Sources, I am Marlene Peralta.
Teresa, thank you for being in studio with us today.
Thank you.
As we saw with this piece, the food desert issue seems to be a problem in New York City. And however, the USDA recently came up with a study saying that there are virtually no food deserts in the city. What do you make of that study?
I think that there have been a series of studies that show different things. I know that the USDA has actually developed a measure for food deserts that is supposed to be applicable to the nation. And that measure is not necessarily an accurate view of what's happening in New York City. Food deserts do exist.
Talk a little about that measure.
The measure that the USDA has used, and I believe that the USDA does support the contention that there are food deserts in the nation, is that based on the amount of low-income people in an area, and in that area, retail market, grocery store that may sell fresh fruits and vegetables is within a mile or more than a mile from people living in that low-income area. And one of the ways that that doesn't necessarily jive with what's happening in New York City is the fact that in New York City, 20 streets is a mile. And so going each way, 20 streets each way to get to your nearest retailer that may serve or sell fresh fruits and vegetables is a long way for a New Yorker. I mean, this is a town of people who don't get in their car and just go to the grocery store. It's a town of people who walk. And so in that sense, while we appreciate the measure that the USDA has proffered to accommodate the diversity of the United States, we do not think that it accurately depicts the lack of healthy food availability in New York City.
What's exactly the prevalence of food deserts in the city?
I couldn't give you an exact. You know, as you mentioned, there are definitely reports that say there are certain parts of New York where there are several opportunities to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. There's an abundance or a prevalence of grocery stores. But it reminds me of the Chico Marx quote, are you going to believe me or my eyes? And when you actually go into certain neighborhoods and communities, when you go into the South Bronx, when you go into areas of East New York, Brownsville, and Brooklyn, what you see is a lot of fast food restaurants. What you see are a lot of unhealthy options for people to choose from. The problem is that those are also some of the most affordable. There are supermarkets in a few places, but definitely not enough to say that we don't have food deserts in New York City.
Could there be a problem also with the way that USDA maps these stores where the stores are on the map, the food stores are on the map, but there's also an issue of what they carry, the produce that they carry. Is that an issue as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to not approach the food desert issue, too narrowly. You have to think of it almost like a tripod. There are three different prongs to this issue. One of them is access, which we're discussing now, the geography and how close, a retailer is. But you also have to look at quality. There are some supermarkets, there are some small retailers, bodegas, corner stores that could offer fruits and vegetables, but what is the quality? Right now, not just in the United States, but also in New York City, we're really pushing toward, wholesome, organic, fresh produce. And just because produce is there, it doesn't mean that it's fresh.
I saw in a mainstream article somebody quoting a doctor actually saying that frozen peas are better than fresh peas. And so the idea that you don't have fresh produce, therefore you don't carry healthy foods, is flawed, because you can have the frozen food, which is just as healthy.
In some instances, I think it's important to pull back and not overgeneralize. I agree. Some people say raw is better than steamed. Some people say steamed is better than raw. I think that when you look at, and so then that goes on to the third prong. So we have access, we have quality, and we have affordability. So frozen, fresh, how much does it cost? Even if you go into a grocery store, you go into a retail outlet, it could be there, it could be fresh, but what does it cost? And when you look at low-income neighborhoods and having to make those tough choices, stretching your food dollar, sometimes you can't afford the frozen or fresh peas. You can't afford the romaine, you have to get the iceberg, or maybe you just have to get, something else that may substitute as a vegetable, maybe a bean. And so when you look at food deserts, it's important not to look at it in a vacuum. You have to look at access, quality, and affordability.
It's been pointed out that West Harlem has high obesity rates, even though in the heart of it there's Fairway supermarket, and the store even offers free shuttles to people to come to it. The prices are decent there. How do you explain the rates of obesity there, given that the supermarket has been there for about 15 years or so?
Well, what's decent? That would be my question. When you say that a price is decent, and you're mentioning, one, grocery store outlet in a large part of Upper Manhattan. I mean, there are path marks in Upper Manhattan as well. And it's good that store offers that service. But when you look at what's decent, I think that it's important not to rush too far past that term. Right now, when you look at the poverty rate in the United States, and the fact that for a single adult who is working or looking for work, who's on food stamps, they have approximately, I'd say, less than $30 a week, maybe in their average food stamp benefit. And that doesn't go very far. So when you go into, and even when you look at maybe 2 working adults and 2 children in a household, you still are looking at a very small food stamp benefit. Now, we support the use of food stamps, and we know that it helps, but even when you are having to stretch your food stamp dollar or your dollar on food, how can you determine what is a decent or fair or average price? In the past few decades, the cost of fresh fruits and vegetables has increased 40%, and the cost of fast food, or let me say this, calorie-dense foods, energy-dense foods, potato chips and soda, the cost of that has decreased 15 to 20%. And so I'll give you an example. Yesterday I was actually in a Pathmark. I live in West Harlem. And the woman in front of me had 2 items. She had a half gallon of milk, and she had a bunch of bananas, 5 bananas. And she asked the sales associate, how much are the bananas? And I think she said, maybe a little bit less than $2. And the woman couldn't get the bananas. All she walked away with was a gallon of milk. That was all she could afford. Having to make that decision is something that no one should have to deal with. And so again, for you and I, a couple of bucks for a bunch of bananas, that's fine. But for her, it was a deal breaker. And so we have to really look at some of those nuanced situations.
How are the USDA findings hamper your ability, or affect, I should say, your ability to help?
As far as our organization, I don't think that they do. Again, it's really being able to come here and talk to individuals like you and share information. Basically, I guess, letting people know that there is information that's available, but sometimes it's not an accurate depiction of what's actually happening in people's everyday lives. I mean, the USDA is a federal government agency, and so the report that they put out, again, is based on a standard measure, and it affects pretty much all the states in the union, but that does not really give a good accurate snapshot of what's happening at the individual, local, city, neighborhood level. And so for us, it's really going into the communities where we see the food deserts, so we see the lack of affordability. For us, one of the programs we have is a CSA program. CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture. We have 7 of them, 1 in every borough, 3 actually in Brooklyn. And it's our way of bringing fresh, farm direct vegetables and fruits to neighborhoods that we feel can't afford those types of goods. And so that's one of the ways that we're helping. And this type of report, while it's informative, and again, we appreciate the work of the USDA and these other studies, again, we know that that's not, the accurate depiction that people have to face in their daily lives.
We have to leave the discussion here. Teresa Hassler,
Yes.
thank you very much for being in studio with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Still to come on Independent Sources, what's being done to end the sexual abuse of women during wars.
Before that, Abby Shola has some other news.
Thanks, Vianora. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic media. From El Diario La Prensa, the Latin transgender community in New York says they've suffered from police stop and frisk tactics more than any other group. Many say they've been subject to racial discrimination, physical abuse, and sexual harassment. Some also say they've been arrested on false charges of prostitution. Dozens of transgender Hispanics rallied at the headquarters for Make the Road New York recently in support of Councilmember Jumaane Williams' proposed bill to regulate stop and frisk. Those who participated are also demanding a No to Condoms as Evidence Act, since many have been accused of prostitution when carrying more than 2 condoms. Over 100 security cameras will soon be installed throughout Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods in Brooklyn. The Forward reports that community volunteers will run a $1 million state-funded plan to have high-tech security cameras installed near schools, synagogues, and street corners in Borough Park, Flatbush, and Midwood. The Libby Kletsky Security Initiative was named for the 8-year-old Orthodox Jewish boy who was kidnapped and murdered in Brooklyn last year. Kletsky was abducted while walking home alone from school. The Korea Times reports that some members of the Korean community in Queens are annoyed with the Korean translation on a city signpost. The sign located in Brown Park asks spectators not to remove or harm wildlife in the area. It includes Spanish, Chinese, and Korean translations. However, the Korean translation uses informal Korean, which can be interpreted as rude in this case. The Korea Times explains that the use of formal and informal Korean is based on the age and status of the speaker and listeners. And finally, large shipping containers parked outside of some neighborhoods in the Bronx are causing a stir among residents. DNAinfo.com reports that local West African immigrants have become infamous for parking large trailers on various streets in the Morrisania section of the Bronx. The trailers are used to ship goods like clothes, electronics, and cars back to their homeland. Residents are complaining that the trailers have become eyesores in the community. According to DNAinfo.com, a dozen have already been towed within the last month. Those were just a few headlines from the ethnic media. Back to Gary and Vianora.
Thanks, Abby. Centuries ago, St. Augustine described rape during wartime as an ancient and customary evil, and sadly, it's still true today.
The numbers are startling. Nearly 2 million rapes during World War II and an estimated 500,000 during the Rwandan genocide. Rape is so prevalent in many conflicts that the UN Security Council recently called it a tool of war. Several scholars say it's used strategically as a means of humiliating and terrorizing a people.
Even as reporting on the issue has improved, advocates fighting to end this practice say there is still much to be done. I spoke with Yasmin Hassan of the women's rights group Equality Now and Lauren Wolf of the Women Under Siege Project about the issue of rape during wartime. Yasmin, rape in war is as old as war itself. Why do you think this whole issue is getting as much attention nowadays?
Well, I mean, really, it's been in the last 2 decades that this has been an issue, and I would give credit to the women's rights movement. Equality Now, which is what I belong to, we were formed in 1992, and at that time we saw that international community really didn't give any priority to women's rights at all. They were seen as national issues. Everything in war that happened to men were war crimes. What happened to women was men will be men or boys will be boys. So really the reason we started Equality Now was to change that focus and to say, and so I think women's rights communities and later on joined by the human rights community have done a lot of work to get rape be recognized as a weapon of war, and the UN has done a lot. There's a lot of international jurisprudence on this. There are now Security Council resolutions and so on. But the impetus for all this really, I think, came from the women's rights movement.
Lauren, what do you think? What else is contributing to this awareness?
Well, I've actually noticed a real movement toward talking about rape and sexualized violence in the last year or so. It's really come to a fore. A lot of the work I did at the Committee to Protect Journalists was about sexual violence in journalists, and you've heard a lot about that since Lara Logan and Lindsay Addario. And also with the Peace Corps, there was a whole movement against rape in the Peace Corps and that whole process of finding justice. I think Yasmin is right. The women's movement has done a lot to bring this out, but I also feel that women, average women, are really saying we don't want to take this anymore. It's just a gut feeling I'm getting.
The UN has been proactive in this, and it has a mission to stop it. So can you talk to us a little bit more about that, Yasmin?
Yeah, I mean, again, what we do at Equality Now is we try to actually prevent violence against women from happening, and then when it happens, have better measures to address it, going forward. So we want to make sure laws are in place, they're implemented. Now, when conflict happens, those are all wiped out. There's no justice system, there's no national government that you can go to for accountability. So what redress do we have? We have to go to international bodies, right? So the UN is in the forefront of this. The international community has to address this issue as an international issue because it's very difficult to address it as a national at the national level. And I think a lot, if you look in the last 2 decades, a lot has happened in that sense. But so there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of resolutions passed, there's a lot of cases that have great decisions, but what does it mean for the women on the ground? This continues to happen. If you see DRC and the recent conflicts, it's getting worse and worse. So we really have to...
You mean the democratic, in Congo?
In the Congo, okay. Yes, yeah. So sorry about that. So we really have to think much more actively about solutions, right? Implementation. I think very, very key is focusing on ending impunity by any means, because what happens in the aftermath of this, of the conflict, if it is not addressed, not only can the victim not move forward, a whole culture of rape and impunity is created. And you see this in the Congo right now, other countries, whereas at the same time, there is also, aftermath of conflict is also a time for positive change. So if you see Rwanda, Liberia, they have re-examined their legal systems, their laws in place now are much better. So, and that's part of the international community came in, they helped those countries rebuild. And again, things are not perfect, but I think that we really need to focus, number one, on prevention, right? And by prevention, I mean look at the status of women in community before the conflict actually happens. Now, why is it that somebody can rape a woman and feel that this will destroy the whole community? That has to say something of status of women in that community. So prevention, and then if this happens, redress. Redress can,
There's a couple of conflicts that come to mind, El Salvador, Sri Lanka, where rape was not used as a tool. In Sri Lanka, it was because of religious reasons. And
where rape was used as a
was
tool.
not.
I would argue that there is no known conflict right now in the world or in the last 100 years we can point to where sexualized violence has not been used as a tool of war. My project, Women Under Siege at the Women's Media Center, was founded by Gloria Steinem, and the impetus for founding it was based on her reading a book about rape and the Holocaust. And you would assume that that's a very non-controversial subject. I mean, it's a horrible subject, but you would just think people were killed, it was a genocide, there was rape, as in any genocide. But this is a history that's been suppressed for many reasons. In the Holocaust, people don't want to look to women suffering necessarily. They say, an entire people suffered, many people suffered in the Holocaust. So women's stories really fell by the wayside. There's also a tremendous stigma and shame when a woman has been raped, not just for her, but for her family. So the story just goes untold. So when Gloria read that, she was really moved to say, if we had known this, could we have prevented Bosnia, Rwanda, Congo, any of that? And just interestingly, recently, to pick up on what Yasmin said about impunity, I agree completely. Part of what we're doing at Women Under Siege is really examining the culture that creates rape specific to each country. And like you said, how do you stop this from happening? You have to really understand how it's being used as a tool of war. And from there, we're looking at legal remedies. And a really interesting case just happened at the end of January in Guatemala. The former president, Efrain Rios Montt, was finally indicted on war crimes charges. And that was back from crimes he carried out in 1983, basically. 200,000 people died in the Guatemalan genocide, and 100,000 women are estimated to have been raped. First of all, the world doesn't really know this. Second of all, there's been no redress. And I was in Guatemala a few weeks ago with a delegation from the Nobel Women's Initiative, and it was a group of women. We were traveling through Honduras, Mexico, and Guatemala, meeting with women on the ground, hearing their stories. And women told me, who were old enough to remember the genocide and their own rape. It's very hard for them to discuss, but they would tell me about their daughters now being raped because the same conditions are still existing.
Well, to Gloria's point, I mean, what has been done?
Well, that's exactly it. Very little has. And that's why, as you were saying, ending impunity is so crucial. So this arrest of this former president is bringing hope, finally.
And also hearing women's voices, like as Lauren just pointed out, like hearing their voices, what they have to say. Because so often women who've been subjected to sexual violence are silenced not only by themselves, by their communities, by their nations and all that. Hearing their voices is therapeutic. It shines a light on what happened. And then having those voices influence policy going forward, right? That's what some of the UN things, like it is essential in peace building or in addressing to have women involved in decision making.
Let me ask this question. It's been sort of like hanging there. Who are the biggest perpetrators? Are we talking about regular armies or militias? Is there a difference? Or
it's both. And that's one thing I'm trying to figure out right now. In each conflict, I like to really break it down. Is it the state perpetrating it, like in Rwanda, where there was a mass propaganda campaign against Tutsi women as whores and they should be raped and killed, inciting the people. And in Guatemala, I'm looking at, was it state ordered back in the early 80s? But so often, as in DRC, it's so many different militias and there are so many reasons they're raping. I mean, it's fascinating. They're raping because they believe that it gives them power on the battlefield to rape a woman in some cases.
And then it's compounded by UN peacekeepers. That's the other thing, right?
In
so
Haiti.
the party, in everywhere, right? So in DRC and all the in Sudan, it is compounded by that, and the UN is looking at that issue right now. But I feel that it's the saddest thing is like people who are meant to be part of the solution when they add to the problem, right?
Beyond passing resolutions, what can the UN do?
Well,
well, part of it is, I mean, they have to be much more stringent with peacekeepers that go on the ground as the conflict is happening. Not only internal guidelines so the peacekeepers don't abuse, but that the peacekeepers have to take this seriously and try to put an end to it, right? So it has to be a priority, number one. Secondly, for those peacekeepers who have contributed to it, there must be justice, must be swift, it must be immediate, and it must have some, what do you call it? The resonance, right? So that there's, thirdly, I think the UN has to involve women much more in the rebuilding, right? There have been resolutions saying women must participate in the rebuilding of state process. I have yet to see it properly being implemented
in
and made a
Liberia,
reality.
perhaps. Liberia is maybe the only example where women really were crucial in ending the war and in building the peace.
Right.
So no wonder they elected a woman president.
Well, she's very crucial.
One final question that I have on this is, what's the trend? Is it decreasing or is it augmenting?
The number of rapes.
Rapes, across the world.
I mean, we can state the simple number that 400,000 women are estimated right now to be raped in Congo every year, and that's from a very well-done study recently in May. With that number alone, and then adding up what's going on from Syria to Libya to Egypt, down through Colombia, Guatemala, and Latin America, across Burma, it's so massive. There's no way to really put your finger on a number, and that's what's crucial for people to know right now, that this is a human rights crisis. This is a crisis for women.
Thank you very much. Yasmin Hassan, Lauren Wolf, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
You can learn more about the Women Under Siege Project by visiting the website womenundersiegeproject.org.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned.
Till next time, be independent-minded.